one opens a dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, you find that there's an entry under the word demon that refers to demons in science, scientific demons.
Jimena Canales, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to talk to you.
So you're a historian of science. In philosophy, people often study the history of philosophy because it helps them do philosophy. It helps them inform their current debates and their ways of investigating questions. When it comes to science, scientists very rarely study the history of science very closely. So if the history of science isn't useful to scientists, what is it useful for?
Oh, the history of science should be useful for scientists and for other people, for everybody. I mean, in one sense, you can argue that the only real natural experiment that's available to us is history. Scientists, the most obvious thing too, scientists are inventing and doing new things, and if they don't know what has been done in the past, they're basically paralyzed. So it is essential. Science is based on this idea of creating novelty and progress, and you cannot do that unless you know history. There is quite a bit of scientists who don't know history and are reinventing the wheel, and as a historian of science, sometimes it's the sad chore of saying, like, well, actually, Helmholtz already discovered that. So that's one aspect. Another aspect that I think is very important is the history of the categories used by scientists. Mm-hmm. So they have their own vocabulary, they've got their concepts, they've got their ontological objects, and they don't realize that there's a reason why they're using those tools and not others, why people in different time periods, different cultures, are working with a completely different set of tools, from language to the actual ontology of what makes up the world.
So one of the things you mentioned there is studying the history of science helps you sort of figure out what science is, how it progresses, what the methodologies of science are. In a piece that you wrote for the Institute of Art and Ideas recently, you said science is much more than this mere procedure of testing hypotheses. It is also a process that permits new things to enter into our world. What do you mean by that?
Thank you. So one of the things that I've come to at this moment in my career, and I when that happens, you kind of regret. You're like, why didn't I start with this? This is really the most interesting aspect of science, and that's the process of discovery. And it's the open-ended part of science, which leads to creating new technologies that are completely unpredictable, that scientists themselves did not know about it. And it's the process of the research bench laboratory scientist that they don't really know what they're going to find. And there is a reason. As a historian, I obviously went back to the reasons. Why don't we focus on this? And there are very important philosophers of science who have told us, you can't analyze the process of discovery. It is too difficult, too tied to the unconscious. It happens in a moment, the stereotypical eureka moment, and we haven't moved as intellectuals past that stereotype. First of all, eureka moments don't exist. They're part of the scientific lore of discovery, and we really have missed out by not studying the process of discovery, the traditions behind discovery, the language that is used in order to analyze what I think is the most important or the most exciting part of science, which is the open-ended aspect.
And in this sort of process of discovery, there are two sort of different schools of thought about how you might think of what scientists are doing there. One says scientists are just discovering structures and ontologies and things that are already there. They're out in the world waiting for us to kind of, find them and discover them. So it's a kind of archaeological dig of the future.
Right.
And on the other hand, there are those who say, well, really science comes up with concepts constructs new ideas. They're not necessarily discovered in the world, they're invented.
Right.
So
Yes, yes,
how do you
yes.
see the two pictures and how they play a role in
I
scientific
think the
discovery?
question of the relation between discovery and invention is one of the most interesting aspects. Again, a black hole that hasn't been investigated that much. Heinz von Forster, a scientist, important person in cybernetics, was one of the people to talk about it. Einstein also, he was asked about the difference between discovery and invention, and he said, somebody else was going to discover the laws of thermodynamics. That's discovery, but nobody was going to do the Beethoven's Eroica symphony. So there is a difference, but would be hard pressed to say that the difference is not political, social, economic, and situated in particular historical moments. It is threatening in one sense to think of scientists as inventors. That's a category that goes more towards the engineer, the artist, the creative professions, and that it points to this aspect that I talked about, the open-ended search that scientists are there, because discovery assumes, as you point out, that there's something already there that just needs to be uncovered, and that is an important difference between both. But we have, in terms of the history and philosophy of science and science in the cultural sphere, we generally just focus on those parts of science that is, this is the stereotype of how the scientific method works. There's a hypothesis, there's an experiment, and you do tests to determine the truth. Carl Sagan was one of the important people to portray science in this way. He called it the baloney detection kit. So if you want to figure out if something's true or false, real or not real, you do an experiment and then you determine that. But that's just one aspect of science. There's another one that has to do with invention, that has to do with creating new things. And we need to focus on both.
So in your book, Bedeviled, A Shadow History of Demons in Science, you make the case in some way for this more creative, imaginary side of science. So you argue that these imaginary entities, demons, have had a pivotal role in the development of science. And someone might say, well, if science is about our effort to uncover the real, what's there already, how can something that's just made up, an imaginary entity like a demon, have anything to do with science?
That's the challenge that I took on in the book, and I started because I learned that scientists very frequently use the word demon in their own vernacular. It's in the laboratory language, informally, and it is used when they are thinking about something that doesn't fit into their current scientific paradigm, when they're thinking about what might break the law of nature that they are investigating. And they, very curiously, they have a tradition of using the word demon. They frequently give the demon the last name of the scientist who first came up with those ideas. Mm-hmm. So if one opens a dictionary, the Oxford English Dictionary, you find that there's an entry under the word demon that refers to demons in science, scientific demons. And it starts generally with Descartes' demon, and Maxwell's demon is the most well-known. So in my book, I go progressively through the history of these demons in order to try to figure out what motivates science into creating certain research programs and going into certain research directions and not others. But going back to the second part of your question, when I talk to scientists, they're like, Jimena, but these demons are imaginary. They're not real. So we just use them as heuristics. And I'm like, exactly. that's what's more important. In fact, when demons were not deemed imaginary, I think they were less powerful than when they are understood as imaginary creatures that might exist. Nobody knows nobody has ruled out their existence forever and for all periods of times, but they're definitely not found. They motivate search, they motivate new experiments to be created, and that leads to discovery.
You mentioned that demons can act as this kind of like heuristic device. It's useful to have this concept. It helps scientists do their work. What if someone were to say, well, aren't all scientific entities in some ways imaginary, heuristic? Aren't electrons and quarks and neutrinos and all these kind of things that we think are physical things, real things somewhere out there, kind of heuristic devices, imaginary concepts that scientists come up with because they're useful, because they help them predict what will happen?
Yes, I mean there's obviously a difference between things that are determined socially and as real, such as electrons, which at one point were sort of sought for, and philosophers of science have wondered about what type of existence these entities have. So that takes us to the question of what exists in the world. And what is interesting is that we don't ask that question a lot. Ontology is a very niche area in the philosophy of science, but I think that it is very important to start to look at this strange, prohibited question of how non-existence become real and how new things come to exist. And again, I think I've as a historian figured out why we haven't done this, and there is something that threatens to take away the certainty and that aspect of science of determining what is real and what works in the world if we go down that other alternative route. But I think we need to go there.
When it comes to demons, can you give us what you think is the most compelling example of its use in science that sort of helped with a theoretical change or a technological advancement?
Well, let me start with the first one that appears in the dictionary entries, Descartes' demon. He called it, in the discourse of method, he called it malignum genium, using the Latin. And then the name demon was given to it subsequently. And this happens frequently with demons. Laplace's demon was at some point called an intelligence, a geist, a ghost, and before they enter the tradition of demons. So Descartes' demon was a very curious creature, and Descartes was a very curious thinker. And he starts, his book by saying, I have always been very interested in distinguishing what is real and what is not, right? But he took that question, that interest, to a level that most people didn't. And one of the things he asked was, what would happen if there's a creature, this malignum genium, that would install an alternative reality in front of my eyes, my sensations? How could I then know what's real and not real? And he says, there's certain things that I can still know, even if this demon is operating. I will still know that a circle is made of a circumference going around a point. I will still know that a triangle is made of 3 angles and 3 sides. I will still know that 2 + 3 = 5. So he developed the laws of logic, and this is Cartesian logic. This is why Descartes is called the father of philosophy, sometimes the father of mathematics, and we forget that the origin of that was really the sphere of this demon. So now, what technologies are connected to that? Virtual reality, theater. at the time that Descartes was thinking about this demon, he was reading El Quijote from Cervantes, and he was very worried about how incredible the new illusions in theaters were, and the power of theaters and novels. It's no accident that inside the novel of El Quijote, it's also about illusions and what is real and what is sanity and what is the difference between new media novels and reality. We have only in looking for Descartes' demon, in trying to find them, we have only taken these technologies into a more extreme, radical, and interesting place.
So a lot of people, I think, tend to think of science as the paradigmatic rational human activity, right? One that is guided by empirical evidence, mathematical rigor, experiment. Is your project basically trying to show that that's maybe a mistaken conception of science, and that science is also shaped but maybe by the irrational and the imaginary, and not just the kind of experimental, the mathematical, the rigorous?
Well, I like the focus on not just. It is that. It is a very important role of science, and it is why scientific instruments are useful for us, why we want to know the temperature and we look, have a thermometer, and why we want to be healthy and we take a vaccine. All those aspects are incredibly important and valuable and, admiring. But then there's another aspect of science, and this is the one that I think has been neglected in the history and philosophy of science, and that has to do with the creation of including the creation of new instruments. So we use all the instruments, we use them to determine what exists, what doesn't. We use all experiments, but we also completely change experimental systems, and we look and we create new instruments that then reveal new aspects of nature. And what leads us to create these new instruments? What motivates us to then find something else in nature, discover, but discover through invention. And that aspect of science, I think we need to think about it more, and it is as valuable as the other one. So they're complementary.
Do you think one of the reasons why historians of science and maybe philosophers of science haven't focused so much on this part of science that you are looking at is a worry that if we make science to be too much about imagination and creativity, it will trickle down into the popular imagination as something that isn't really all that rigorous and isn't really all that, different to fiction, and you end up then with people disbelieving in scientific results because they say, well, it's just someone's creative theory, they just imagined this, and why should I take it seriously?
Absolutely, I think that's the worry. But my hope then is that if we go down this route, we will not only make a contribution for how we think about science, we will make a contribution to how we think about the humanities, and to also understand those aspects of the humanities that are not all, about creative, but they're also about determining the truths. We can go back to an area that I find incredibly interesting, the laws of fiction. And this was common in ancient times. You have the Aristotelian concept of the unity of action. What makes a good story work? What makes a good story credible? There is a lot about the supposed humanities and the arts that is very similar to how we think about science and how we think about experiments, plots, narratives. So my hope is that, or what we need in order to counter that worry that you have, that if we go down and study those creative, imaginary aspects of science, we'll end up with pseudo beliefs and lose all sort of certainty and credibility, is that we also make a contribution to the humanities and say, well, there's a lot of rigor here, and there's a lot of here too that doesn't permit us to do anything with a story, with a narrative.
As a historian of science, if you could travel back into the past, is there a scientific era of discovery that you would have liked to witness up close?
Oh my God, that is a difficult question. As somebody who has studied time travel.
Yeah, because you also work on Einstein's theory of time.
Yes. Well,
maybe that time, maybe the 20th century golden era of physics, quantum mechanics coming into the picture, relativity coming into the picture.
I think I would go back to the romantic, the scientists, and that I think that's connected to my current interest in this sort of more open-ended. We're in the age of discovery. That the age of discovery was a moment in which the search for the open-ended, the travel, the looking for something new, was part of the scientific process. We couldn't think of any of the discoveries during the scientific revolution all the way to Darwin and Humboldt, without picturing them on a boat and going to interesting places and finding that out. So maybe that's the place of science that I wouldn't go to the 1930s in Germany.
Yeah, fair enough. Do you think science has lost part of that romantic sense of wonder and awe about the world? I mean, Weber, again, around the same time that we just mentioned, talks about science disenchanting the world, making the world into a mechanical, soulless kind of thing. Do you think?
I think that has been lost. Although science is a very complex aspect, there's it's very diverse. There are people looking for viruses and in bat caves, but the specialization of science. I'm not the first one to lament this, and the division between the sciences and the humanities. I think has impoverished it.
And what are you working on currently? Are you continuing this arc of looking into the real and the unreal in science?
Yes, yes, I am.
Very good. Jimena Canales, thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexis. A pleasure to talk to you.